Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Humanist Canada's December webinar in our monthly webinar series. My name is Ian McMillan, and I'll be your host this afternoon in place of the wonderful Anna Popovich, who is on vacation. We'll be together today for 60 minutes, including the Q&A period after today's presentation. If you have a question during today's presentation, please do feel free to pop it into the Q&A functionality on your Zoom screen, or you can also raise your hand and we will call on you as we see your hand being raised to ask that question live. We'll ask you to unmute and you'll be able to ask your question directly. For anyone asking a question, please, just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. And so let's introduce our speaker today. We're going to be talking about co-housing communities and are joined by Linda Kruus, the Directing Manager at Ottawa Cohousing. Hey, Linda. Linda was an integral member of the Farm Boy construction and equipment purchasing team for 5 years, and the distribution and facilities manager at Bridgehead Coffee for close to a decade, where she coordinated 3 teams for 15 coffee shops. Linda holds a Bachelor of Industrial Design from Carleton University and continues her learning through webinars, courses, and conferences about all things related to building co-housing communities and supporting groups in reaching that goal. Welcome, Linda, and thanks so much for being here today. I'll pass it over to you to get started.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you to Humanist Canada for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm really interested in your organization, and I hope that what we can talk about here will be of interest to some of you going forward. I'll just apologize. My voice is a little rough and I may cough once or twice during the presentation. I'm just getting over a cold or flu, whatever half of Canada seems to have right now. So let's start off with getting an understanding of what we're talking about when we speak about co-housing. People within the co-housing community are a little careful when we use the word co-house. It's often used in a variety of ways to even sort of 2 households living under the same roof might say that they're co-housing, which is fine. But when we're talking about co-housing communities, we're talking about a specific type of community and a specific type of setup with the residents. So I'll just go into my slides. I'll share my screen here. So co-housing is a form of an intentional community. So intentional community is the broader term for a series of different types of ways that residents get together to sort of share resources. And co-housing communities are one subset of intentional communities. Co-housing combines private homes with large, generous communal spaces and shared resources. So each household has their own private unit, fully functioning, but they also have an interior and exterior shared space together. They are typically owned by the owner. So there's investment by the owner, there's equity investment in the co-housing unit by the owner. So they can then, if they're leaving the community, they can sell their unit on at market retail prices. So that makes them really good real estate investments, actually. Different to co-housing, but similar, are cooperatives. Cooperatives can look very close to co-housing and what they share and the way people are living within them. Like in a cooperative, you might have a fully functioning individual unit and you're sharing a property. The difference being sort of the legal setup in this case. In a cooperative, you are a tenant of the co-op and you collaborate as well in keeping the building and the grounds in good shape. But when you leave the cooperative, you're leaving as a tenant basically, and you don't have any equity that's formed over time in your particular unit. So this is a little bit different from co-housing. Cooperatives, to their benefit, are often subsidized by the government. It's a very strong model. For example, in Quebec, they're highly visible in Quebec, especially. Intentional communities it's the broad umbrella term. It's also used for very large communities that have a very specific intent to them. So they may be faith-based, they may be running a business as part of their community. Eco-villages would fall under this banner of intentional community. One of the most famous ones is Finhorn in Scotland. It's a very large community, and they do lots of training and projects out of them. So they're one of the more famous intentional communities that's out there. And then as a small subcomponent of intentional communities would be co-living. And this is much closer to like being in a boarding house, for example, where you might have your own personal space and bathroom, but you're sharing a kitchen and you're sharing your living space. So it's more closely connected living than co-housing, where you have a completely separate unit. So that would be the differences between these different types of intentional communities. So here's what co-housing is specifically. So the communities for co-housing are formed by households. And in this term, we use the term household for being, it could be an individual, a couple, or a family. We call all of those a household. Each household gets a unit, their own private unit. And they share, but they share the property together, and they share both an interior and an exterior space on the property. Typically, the communities are formed with people who have similar values and goals, and they want to live in the same location, whether that's an urban location or rural sort of type of community. They will need the same vision in order to be successful. The communities can vary in size, and when I talk about size, sure, we're talking about land mass, but we're also talking about the number of households that are included. For example, here in Ottawa, just now in December, the Soul Sisters, it's a group of 4 women, and they have a co-housing community of just 4, and they're just moving in now in December. They finished construction, they've just moved in. So that is probably the smallest you'll ever see. And some people might even say that's not exactly a co-housing community because it's so few people, but their whole structure is exactly like a co-housing community. They each have their own unit, and they also share some of their space together within the same building. They can go as big as 80, for example. The most typical range is about 12 to 25 or 30 households within a community. You're kind of looking at about a 20 household. If you think of it like a classroom, 20 households is very comfortable. You're sharing a lot of the work required in organizing your community and maintaining it. But at the same time, it's not so big and onerous that you can't organize yourselves as a group. And you're likely to find somebody who's very amicable to you if you have more people. So for a sustainability perspective, if you want your community to survive over many decades, for example, slightly larger communities work better, but they do need to have affinity together in order to really work. Communities are also formed where everybody has an equitable say in the community. So when you're forming your governance for the co-housing communities, they need to be cognizant of this, and they form under certain organizational structures where everybody has a say in how the community is run. And there's different ways of doing this, but it's sort of an important component to understand how these differ, for example, from a condo, where you're really feeding your info into a condo board, and then there's some say there, for example. So this goes down to my last point here on this slide, is that often 95% of co-housing communities formed in North America are formed as legal condominiums. And if you live in a condo or you're familiar with them, it's kind of the same setup legally and structurally, in that you have your own unit, but you're on a shared common ground. The large difference between a condo and how a co-housing community runs is the intent of the co-housing community is to be communal and to share things, including shared meals occasionally, including shared resources. The other point, like I said, everybody has an equitable say in the co-housing community, so they will be organized a little differently from a functional and operational perspective than a regular condo might. And you're entering it, often when you're entering a new co-housing community and you're part of developing it, you're getting very much what you're looking for as far as the amenities that you want to share. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about a co-housing community. I'm going to just going to hop out here for a second so I can see you. So how did co-housing communities come about? They actually started back in Denmark in the 60s and 70s. People there started to understand that they wanted to share resources and share land together. And Denmark's been very successful with developing co-housing communities, but they've of course had a much longer time period to do so. The Netherlands and other European countries picked it up, and you can find co-housing communities all over the world, but the majority of like the oldest ones will be found in Denmark. They were brought to North America in the early 1990s, were the first ones that started here in North America. There was two pivotal architects who brought it to North America, Charles Durrett and Catherine McCannett. So they did go to Denmark and actually studied co-housing communities there and brought that model back, and have been pivotal ever since as two sort of leading co-housing consultants here in North America, developing it here. The first one in Canada is out in Langley. It's called Windsong, and I do believe Charles Durrett was the architect for that. And that was in, I believe, 1994 is when Windsong developed. And shortly after that, a series of them were developed in the lower mainland of Canada. And you find in the United States, there are a lot of them on the western side of the United States, California, Oregon, but you find them all over in the United States as well. They come in different types and sizes. So like I said, when you form your co-housing community, you're forming with people with the same values and goals as you. So your goal might be quite specific. For example, we're seeing more older adult communities being formed, so 50+ communities. I don't want to call them senior communities because you do need a range of adult ages in there in order for it to be successful and sustainable. But it's a really viable and accessible way to age in place. So a lot of people are attracted to co-housing as they look towards retirement, for example. So you're seeing more of those. There are a couple of women-only co-housing communities out there. There are some that are queer-focused, for example, so that you're building a community that you're really comfortable in, for example. And there is a lot of talk, especially among people who have been doing co-housing for a while, trying to do more models of co-housing where you can bring in more affordable housing and subsidized housing. It's very tricky to do this without outside governmental help, for example. And this is because in order to form a community, you really need good financial backing to start with. You're really looking for the majority of the ownership to be owned by the residents. And that's sort of especially here in Canada, that's what we've had to do so far. So it's been hard to incorporate more affordable housing within the co-housing community, although it would be really quite beneficial. I'm going to go back to my slides and show you some of the benefits. These are just outlined them for you. So here are some of the benefits to living in a co-housing community. So the bulleted benefits here are what's particularly beneficial for the residents themselves. In a co-housing community, you can formulate environmental benefits. You can create a more carbon reduced way of living because you're sharing resources, because you're sharing things together, you're sharing walls, you're sharing ceilings if you're in a community where you're within the same buildings, for example. So because you're living a more compressed way, you're also reducing potentially your parking required, the vehicles required, because you might be doing a car share within your community. So just the whole aspect of being able to share resources and space makes it a more environmentally friendly way to live. So it's a great attraction to people who are looking to lower their eco footprint. The other benefit there is if you can pool your money together, your extra money together, you might be able to afford something, like a ground source heat pump or a solar panel, something you might not be able to afford on your own in a single family home. But when you pool it together with the other residents, you might be able as a group to take advantage of some of those great new technologies, for example. There's a lot of security that people get out of living in a co-housing community. You know your neighbor, basically. So so if you're leaving, you're going away for a while on a trip, you know who's going to take care of your home. You know someone can take care of your pets, for example. So people find great security comfort in being in a co-housing community. There's people always around, right? There's economic and practical benefits to co-housing. These are as I was saying, when you form your community, most of them are formed with majority ownership. So the economic benefits really come in over time. It's not that moving into co-housing is going to be cheaper than getting your own new home. It's about the same, but over time, as you're sharing resources, you can find a lot of economical benefits. Of course, there's social benefits. And interestingly, there are more introverts than extroverts finding themselves in co-housing, because for an introvert, for example, you're in a community and you have your buddies established for you. There's very low effort required to find that social connection, something that's easier for extroverts, for example. But of course, for extroverts, it's like social heaven, because whenever they're looking for that social contact, there's usually someone around. So the way it works in a co-housing community, if you're looking for privacy and quiet solitude, you can just go to your own private unit or your own, and many co-housing communities have their own private balcony, your own private patio space. But whenever you need social contact, if you'd like to eat with other people, it's there for you. So the social isolation that we're experiencing here in a lot of our single family home living is really reduced in co-housing community. And interestingly, because you reduce the social isolation, the health of residents in co-housing communities has been shown to be beneficial. People are healthier and happier in co-housing communities, to the point that there's a study done and they showed that people were able to stay living outside of long-term care, for example, for an additional 4 years before their needs were to the point they need to go to long-term care. So it's a great model for us to look to help our aging population in that regard. I'd like to go to a video of some people that we interviewed just as we were launching our business. These are people who have looked to community for some time, and I'll just share some of their thoughts with you. I'll have to stop share and then I'm just go in here. Just have a listen to these guys.
Why do I want to live in co-housing? I'm just looking ahead, and it just seems like a practical way to live. And we have a big rambling house here that is too big for us, but we don't want to live just in an apartment isolated. So we want to be with other people. I've always been interested in community, and both my husband and I have lived in co-ops in the past, and sort of the direction I want to go.
I signed up instantly and joined and was a very active member, because that's what I thought I would have loved all my life. I love community, caring for other people, privacy within community.
Where you have a community of people or a group of people that you know fairly well, and there's a link, and this is, we're together in this, and there's some shared some shared tasks, obviously some shared financial responsibilities, and just a feeling of mutual support. That's always appealed to me. But I guess I've never really I guess I sort of passed it off as possible in Canada's sort of social environment.
The big advantage is that if you can share a lot of those common spaces, you can actually have a fair bit more usable space for you and your kids than you would if you buy your own house. Right?
Okay.
So you could have the rec room, you could have the pool, or you could have the nice garden and playground and all those things. So I think that's the one draw for people.
Oh, well, community is very important for me. It's
Yeah.
it's the idea of people caring about each other, especially in a city where people seem so individualistic and cold. Right.
Right.
And those
So-
who are part of that cold network, of course, don't recognize it. No, for them it's normal.
I would be really attracted by some indoor space, some indoor shared space with some greenery.
That people would take their meals together, and you know, seniors were available to little kids, and you know, there was just so many benefits to the concept of it.
The concept of co-housing is supposed to be a village.
So you can see why these are all people who have been dreaming of co-housing for many years. They've recognized a long time ago that they don't want to live so isolated, and they see the benefits of sharing resources, for example. There's additional benefits, and I'll just show you some. For example, the way co-housing communities can benefit not just residents, but the communities that they're in. So the neighborhoods that they live in, there's spillover benefits to the neighborhoods, partly because people who live in co-housing tend to be communitarians. They're pretty open and friendly people. And when they feel supported by each other, that now frees them up time to then contribute to the neighborhood around them, to the point where Charles Durrett once quoted that he had experienced a co-housing community of 30 adults where every single adult in that community was doing some form of volunteer work outside of the community. And that's just because when you've got it great and you're living in a very supportive and happy way, you have more to give to your municipality and the world around you. Municipalities as well benefit when people can support themselves. So for example, if you have health concerns within your community and you need someone to take you to the hospital, or you need to get to a medical clinic or whatever, you have someone right there to help you out to do that kind of work for you. You don't have to call an ambulance at that point, or you're less dependent on public transportation even, for example, if you're doing a car share with people. So because people within the community can help each other, it actually reduces the strain on the municipality that they're in, because they're taking up some of that weight that the municipality would often have to fill in with. So that helps. And in fact, for example, I mentioned Windsong, the first co-housing community in Canada in Langley, BC. Langley, the city of Langley, is now assisting a second community to be built in Langley, because they've seen over the last 20 years how Windsong has been beneficial to their municipality. And this is very often in Denmark. In Denmark, municipalities in Denmark are part and parcel of the development of co-housing communities in Denmark. They help form them. I think 1/3 of Danish co-housing communities are formed by the municipality and supported by municipalities to get going, because Denmark, over their 30-40-year history of co-housing, has seen the huge benefit that this has, and they have a very strong demand for people to live in co-housing communities in Denmark, because people have had a chance to see how successful it is. Of course, we have a housing crisis right now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the housing crisis we face does require many solutions on many levels. I would suggest co-housing is one way to facilitate urban intensification and then free up some single family homes that can then be used to create additional housing to meet the needs of our current population and future population. So by no stretch is co-housing the magic bullet, but it certainly can be part of the solution facing our housing right now, especially in urban areas where you can intensify people by putting them into a co-housing community or in an urban situation. For example, you can house potentially 10 households on a lot that normally would only, that's a double lot, for example, that normally only has 2 or maybe 2 semis on it. So you're tripling, quadrupling the number of people who can comfortably live on those 2 lots of property in the urban area. Another benefit that is maybe not so obvious is that because co-housing residents need to learn how to organize themselves and negotiate and collaborate together, they become very good at dealing with problems. They have to learn how to deal with problems that are larger than themselves. So it prepares them to deal with oncoming climate chaos. So they're actually become very good resources for communities and municipalities should that municipality be hit by some of the climate chaos that we see coming around us now. So that's sort of a side benefit that's not very obvious, and that's really because the structure of co-housing requires people who live there to be able to figure things out as a group and to be able to sort of negotiate these things together. So what's the holdbacks? I mean, this sounds great, right? It's not for everyone. Some find this type of community in their own neighborhood, for example. If you're lucky, you're in a neighborhood that has very good neighbors, you can, and you get that kind of support there. Some people have extended families that can provide the support. And in fact, way back when we lived in extended families within our homes, that really was like co-housing community, like a mini version of co-housing communities. And this is co-housing is kind of supplementing what we used to have in a way. So some people don't find they need co-housing communities. They don't feel isolated because they have family and friend networks. Some people are not suited to the level of cooperation and compromise, the collaboration required to live in community. Some people prefer to have full control over their immediate environment, and that's fine. It's not for everyone. But for a lot of people, this is a great way to reduce their isolation. And it's a great way for Canadians to solve some of the current crises that we're in. So what's the holdback? Why are there not more Canadian co-housing communities? 90% of groups that start in Canada fail to complete. If we look at, I'm just going to step out here for a second. I can come back later. I just want to talk a little bit about the differences. So in Denmark, for example, and I know Denmark's had a longer lead time, right? Denmark has 416 co-housing communities. And between 2015 and 2021, 15 to 20 new co-housing communities opened up every year. So, and Denmark has a population of, what is it here? 6 million people. Canada, population of, we're about 38 million. We have less than 30 co-housing communities built, completed. We have many under formation, but that's all we have. So we're way behind Denmark. And how come? That's one of the factors that we talked about, is that Denmark is used to it. They've had a longer lead time, longer incubation time. They've seen the results, proven results. And the character of the culture in Denmark, they're much more socially minded culture, and so that might be a factor. Whereas North Americans tend to be a little more sort of singularly focused, should I call it? There's also a difference. We'll see. So, for example, the majority of Canadian co-housing is in the lower mainland of BC. That's where we see about 20 different co-housing communities. And then beyond that, we're like 1 or 2 per province scattered across the country. Why is that? Why is BC so amicable to co-housing, but not Ontario, where we only have 2 or 3 now in formation? Well, part of that is, as I said, they had the assistance of the US professionals who came to their area early on in the 90s to help develop the first ones. And once you have one community that started, the communities can start to help each other in forming. So in the lower mainland, they became used to the co-housing communities and they saw the benefits. So then more people are interested. Now you have legal representation who kind of know what's going on. They have that Van City is a bank or credit union in the Vancouver area who is quite warm to co-housing communities. They will extend loans to them. So you're having lenders and legal structures that can support it. Here in Ontario, we're new, and we even have a bad name because we've had some groups that have failed to move forward. So we have to prove in Ontario, we have to prove that co-housing communities can work here. And really, so the first ones here face a steeper curve than the ones in BC. I'll go back to my screen here and you can see. So we're talking about the legal knowledge and frameworks. We need legal representation that will work. So this is why I say the move to use condominium legal structure, it's a little limiting and it's kind of expensive, but it's used because that's what developers and the legal and lenders know in Canada. So we move to promote co-housing as a form of condominium or strata, so that they are more familiar and comfortable with doing the lending and doing the legal work for us. That's why condos are used. Zoning and bylaws, there's a lot of, because you're talking about multiple units within the same property, there are zoning and bylaws that prohibit this type of formation of housing. We seem to be shifting. It's been very interesting the last couple of months here in Ontario, for example. There seems to be some shift. People know that there's a housing crisis. They're trying new things out. So it'll be very interesting to see if some of the shifts will be favorable for co-housing. But up to now, it's like a slog. You got to go in and you got to hammer out what kind of get your zoning approval and so forth. So it draws out the process. And the longer your process is, the more expensive it becomes. Developer relationships. This is new for developers. In Denmark, where developers are comfortable with co-housing, they've seen how beneficial it is and how wanted it is for residents, how easy it is to fill up your co-housing community. Developers in Denmark they themselves are creating the communities and then asking people to move in. Now there's you got to be careful there because you still want to have a community that works. You can't just ask anybody to join in and come and live there. You still need to have that group formation and development. So it's still very important to keep that in mind. However, it's just an indication that of the difference. Where in Denmark, they're used to it. The developers are on board and they are very familiar with co-housing. In Canada, they're not, especially in Eastern Canada. So developing a relationship with the developer, someone who can help you build your community, it's an uphill battle to get that relationship that's going to work for you. And tied to that is a lot of the suitable sites for co-housing are under the developer's belt. So if a co-housing, a group of people who want to do co-housing, they're doing it on their own, they're looking for a site, they find it very hard to find sites in time. And now they're bidding on sites against the developers. And, you know, I think it's fairly well known that that can be a losing competition. So if you can find sites with a developer, you'll have much better access to sites as opposed to going on your own, which is what a lot of groups try to do. The cost, so the complexity of project management is also a holdback. There are many balls to hold in the air. An example of this is there's a new Guelph co-housing community. They've just moved in November. So we're really pleased that Watershed is now fully constructed and moved in. That's a small co-housing community of 6 households. The lead household on that project was Dwayne, who is an architect, and he did not work with a developer. He did not work with outside management help, and he thought he could do the project management on his own. And he told me last year, he said that was he recognized now after a 5 or 6 year process that was a mistake, and that the complexity of the project to do a co-housing community was much more than he bargained for. And could he do it over again? He probably would have worked with a developer or with a co-housing consultant to help him with that project management. And he's an architect. He already knows half the process practically. The other thing that groups really need to have a grip on is the cost and the time commitment required by group members. So as I mentioned before, doing a co-housing community, becoming your household within a co-housing community is not necessarily going to be more expensive or less expensive. It should be approximately the same as moving into a new home. However, You need to have, when you're developing a community and you're buying a larger piece of land, you're looking at a larger structure, and you're looking at commons that you have to share together in cost. Some of that cost needs to come up quickly and come up front. It's a little more complicated, your cost structure, and you need to have some funds available early on. And the time commitment required to line all the ducks in a row, to get your group organized, to learn about each other, to understand how you're going to work together. There's a lot of time required to if you want a successful and sustainable community in your group. So these are all the barriers. Oops, I won't go into that yet. So how can we help? How can we overcome the barriers? You can use a co-housing consultant. As I mentioned, the two architects who were the forefront runners in North America, they each have their own co-housing consultant firm. There are co-housing consultant firms here in Ottawa. Ottawa Cohousing, who is me and my partner Rosalind Hill, we are a co-housing consultant firm. If you can use a co-housing consultant, they can help you through the complexity of the project management. They can help you through what kind of legal structure you need. They can help you with, finding the lender and developer relationships that you require. And if you're working with a good architect, they can help you with the zoning and the municipal structures you need to go through. This cost and time commitment is still required by the group. So whatever, even if you're working with a consultant, they can't help you with this unless you're really committed, if your group members really understand this format. So the other thing that helps is if there's a reasonable and real expectations by the members of the group as to how much money they're going to require and how much time they're going to require to build their community together. And then finally, pressuring government on all levels to make changes to facilitate this kind of housing is needed. And this is where we can do changes to the zoning and bylaws. And in formatting the changes to sort of the governmental structures and development structures that are in place right now, this pushes ownership onto financial investors and lenders. They'll become more comfortable with it if now there's like an actual model out there, and if they hear municipal leaders pushing for this kind of housing development. So just briefly, who are we? So as I said, we are one of the co-housing consultants. We work specifically in Eastern Ontario in the National Capital Region. And we're hoping to form this missing piece of the co-housing community development puzzle. We want to help communities form here in Ottawa. We feel if we can get one or two of them going, we might start a little wave and do something that was similar to what happened in the Lower Mainland of BC. Once you get a couple going, we can support each other and get more of them going. So we've only been in business for about a year. We established in January last year and incorporated in May. And we're essentially a matchmaking service. We're a little different from other consultancies in that we're starting with households. We're trying to attract people at a household level and then potentially match them together, whereas other consultants will just work with a group that's already formed. So this is how we do our process. We bring in residents and households together. We do a careful evaluation of what they're looking for and what kind of community they want to do. Once we have enough members that we can group together, we'll form a potential group that we call an affinity group. And if that sort of gels and people want to move forward, we work with them and we move forward on three sort of complementary planks at the same time. We do group work with them so they learn how to become a community. We help them find a site and a development team. And then we also help them to find outside investors if they require so. So we're working on three different sort of planks at the same time with our groups. And then as they move forward, the group needs to select a site. They need to sign an agreement with the development team and they need to establish their financing. During design, the city approval stage and the construction phases, we will work as a liaison between the group and their development professionals. Part of the issue previously with a developer and a co-housing group, it's very hard for a developer to work with a whole group of people. Imagine a group of 15 adults that have to reach a group decision for your developer. That scares them. So we think we can be a huge benefit in becoming the in-between for both sides. We'll have the group's interests at heart when we speak with the development team, and we will be able to get the group to do their decision making in a timely manner for the development team, so we can act as that liaison. And then after construction is finished, we'll be there to help our groups be successful over the long run. We're not going to drop them. We're going to be there to assist them if they need ongoing services. So that's what we do at Ottawa Cohousing. Like I said, there's other co-housing consultants out there, and they may be more suited, but we're certainly available if people are interested specifically in our area. And we can also be contacted just for further resources as well. Another great resource for any of you who are interested in co-housing communities is the Canadian Co-housing Network. It's a really great resource for co-housing in Canada, and within their pages, their website, they list all the different communities within Canada that are built and forming. So it's a really great resource as well. I'm going to open it up to questions now, Ian. I think that's a great way.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was so interesting. I feel like I learned a lot, actually. I really love that. We have about 19 minutes for questions, so just remind everyone, so you can either submit your questions in the Q&A or raise your hand and we'll invite you to speak. And we have a couple of questions here in the Q&A. We'll start with Christina's question. So they ask, what are the pros and cons of having an architect design a co-housing community from scratch rather than just creating a co-housing community using existing infrastructure? And is it even possible to do the latter?
Right, very good question. And I think what Christina is getting to is the design of the community and the structure within it is actually quite important. So from an architect's perspective, yes, from scratch is easiest. They can, then it's like a blank slate, and they can really formulate what they're looking for when they design the community. Is they need to have nodes of interaction for communitarians, for people, for the residents. So there needs to be flows, pathways and flows within the community that will facilitate easy interaction. Something like the commons area, which becomes a focal point. They'll have a shared kitchen, a shared space where everyone can gather. That needs to be, accessible to everybody and sort of a focal point in the community. So for sure, when you work from scratch, it's easier for an architect to develop that kind of really suitable structure. It is possible to do with existing infrastructure, but I'd say like you're looking at a redo, like a full renovation. It may not be possible for all existing buildings, but some buildings might be very amicable to it. For example, there's a group called Love Song in Prince Edward County. That's sort of Eastern Ontario, near Kingston, that area. They have taken over a school, an elementary school that was no longer used, and they're forming a 50 resident seniors co-housing there. So you can imagine a school is not a bad redo, because you have big spaces like the gym, the cafeteria, for example, that could become very good common areas. So depending on the building, you could potentially do it as a renovation. The other thing I didn't mention is one thing co-housing communities often do is they group the parking. So instead of people having individual lanes or driveways, for example, they'll often put them on a lot in the corner, out of view. What you want to have is people like to look at each other, and they'll look at the shared sort of play space for the kids, or the garden or the patio that's shared among everybody. And so they're not looking over each other's cars. They put the cars to the side. That again, it makes it conducive to sharing each other, without having to look at each other's cars. And it's also more beneficial. You have less paved space that way as well. So that's one thing that's very common. And again, if you're working from scratch, that becomes easier to sort of facilitate where are we putting the cars kind of thing.
Awesome. Okay, we have questions coming in rapid fire, so we'll be mindful of
Okay.
time. We'll try to get through as many as we can. I got about
All right.
8 here, and we have about 15 minutes. So,
That's good.
yeah, no, it's great. It's fantastic. I think it shows that people are very interested in this, which is awesome.
Great.
We've got a question from Craig. How does co-housing deal with the issue of vaccine requirements for COVID and flu? And maybe I would expand Craig's question and ask, how does governance around those all those sorts of issues work in these situations?
Yeah, so each community has to form their own guidelines or community manifesto. You can call it all kinds of things. They have a structure in place, and they need to have a structure not only for existing like ongoing sort of operational things, but they need to have in place sort of a decision-making system so that when there's a pandemic, when an issue like vaccines comes up, they have a format that they can follow in order to make the decision as a group. So I think through the pandemic, different communities have dealt with this situation differently. And I know that it has been contentious for some communities, but basically if the community is formed correctly and they have a good decision-making process, they will decide as a group how they want to deal with that. Do we make everyone get vaccinated? Do we stay isolated, right? Everyone follow isolation protocols even within the community, or do we just, our bubble is the community? That's what some groups have done as well. So it really varies, and it really comes down to each community making their own decision together.
Awesome. Okay, we have a question from Gail. What is a common configuration of units and structures? Is it apartments, houses? I guess what does it look like?
So it can look like a bunch of things. If it's a rural community, it might even be single family homes, but not as common, but that is possible. For example, like an eco-village, which is much like a co-housing community, they might have each their own individual household or individual building. But that's in a rural setting where you have more space. In a suburban or urban setting, it's often, it could be row housing. It could be one single building. There's a new co-housing community, for example, in the middle of Vancouver called Little Mountain. They're one single building. There's a 6-story building with I think there are 30 households. Frequently, it'll be a couple of smaller buildings. So it might be a grouping of a couple of buildings, and it might be a mix mash, like a row of houses and then a building that has 6 households in it. So it comes in a variety of fashions, basically. It depends on your site of size, and it depends what's available to you and what the group wants, what they're looking for.
Awesome. I see a question a little further down. Can you repeat the name of the website that you mentioned for finding other co-housing communities? I think you mentioned it near the end. I just want to type it into the chat.
Canadian Co-housing Network.
Okay. Perfect. So you can probably Google that and be able to
Oh, yeah.
find it.
Yeah.
The next question is from Mary. How do you prevent an undesirable personality from moving in next to you?
Oh, good question. So, I'm going to assume Mary is thinking of a community that's already formed. Is that the question? An already formed community, you have somebody new moving in? Or is it in your original, when you're originally putting the group together? I can answer both, but
based on the way the question's phrased, I think maybe the former, but we'll see if Mary can comment. But yeah, I think probably in a pre-existing.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is a common question. So because they're a condominium legal structure, assume it's a condominium legal structure. That means if somebody has to move out or they want to move out and they are looking to sell their unit, they are legally entitled to sell to whomever they want at whatever price they want. However, in joining a community, you're joining the guidelines of your community, the sort of manifesto of the community, and built in there into that manifesto as an agreement is that when you are selling your unit, the process of the person who is purchasing from you, they have to go through sort of a soft process. So each community comes up with their own procedures here. Some communities might say, well, your potential purchaser needs to join 2 of our communal meals. So co-housing will often do a communal meal a couple of times a week or whatever they structure. So that's a way for your potential purchaser. They have to join a couple of those meals to get a sense of the community that they're joining. They might say, they might make them buddy up with somebody in the community so that one person who already lives in the community can get to know them a little bit before they make their final decision to purchase or not. Or they may, for example, they might be required to sleep over one night in the guest house of the community. So all of these measures are for that potential purchaser to understand what they're getting into. And then usually by self-selection, if they're not comfortable with being part of this community, they won't buy it, right? Because they too need to agree with the principles that are put forward to them. So a lot of it is even though legally anyone can purchase it, through these sort of soft regulations or soft guidelines, people usually will buy in or buy out based on whether they want to be part of the community. So that prevents a lot of it. Of course, within the community, there will be other measures for if things go wrong within a community, how do you get rid of the sour apple, or how do you deal with that sour apple if somebody within the community is causing problems? And this can happen. Obviously, you need to be prepared. And again, it comes back to that when a problem arises, what's the structure for our decision making to deal with that problem? So they will lean heavily on the values that they formed at the beginning of their community and on how they're going to deal with problematic characters, for example.
That makes sense. Gail's next question is, what is the usual density within a project?
Density of people?
Let's assume density of people, yeah.
Density. So I'm not really sure what she means. I think I did indicate that a lot of co-housing communities are about 15 to 24 households. That's a pretty common size. And households can be individuals and couples and families. So I don't know if that answers her question of density.
Yeah. Oh, so Gail clarified number of households. So yeah, I think that's.
Yeah. It varies a lot. Yeah. Typically between 15 and 30, I would say, is the most common. But for example, like there's quite a few that are like the Guelph one I mentioned, that's only 6 households. The Soul Sisters here in Ottawa, only 4. And the Terra Firma, also in Ottawa, they're only 7 households. So the actually 3 existing co-housing communities in Ontario are all quite small.
We have a question here from Richard. Is this a variation of strata, which is a BC word for Ontario condo living?
Yes. So yeah. So in BC, they call it strata, and in Ontario, we call it condo. It's the same thing.
Okay. If someone leaves and wants to sell their unit, what control do the other residents have over potential new owners? I think you touched on this a bit.
Yeah. I think that was part of the other question there.
Okay. Are there many, are you aware of any current opportunities for co-housing in Toronto, either incipient or ongoing? And maybe you've covered this a bit.
No, so there is a group called Co-Housing Toronto. I think there's a group that's trying to form. I think they're looking for land. I'm not sure where they're at. I know they're listed on the Canadian Co-Housing Network communities page. And the gentleman who's sort of leading that Co-Housing Toronto project, he also has his own co-housing consultancy. I think they're called Co-Housing Options. So he would be for anyone in the Toronto area, he probably would be the best contact for them. His name's Chris Stevens. Yep. So Co-Housing Options is the consultancy that works in that area. And then, but I think they're called Co-Housing Toronto or Toronto Co-Housing. They're not, but they don't have a site yet, I don't think. So I'm not sure. And I know there's a group in Hamilton. There's a group in Waterloo. So there's a group in Peterborough that's quite far along, actually. I think it's called Kawartha Commons, and they're pretty far. So there are, various groups down there. There's a second one in Guelph forming as well.
Awesome. Okay, we have a 2-part question from Jody. What about a small, not tiny, housing community as a model in a more urban setting? Oh, sorry, that's the first question. And then in a more urban setting, how much land would be required?
Okay, so first question again, Ian?
What about a small, not tiny housing community as a model?
Small, not tiny housing. So, okay, I'm not sure I'm answering the right question, but we actually have people on our roster who are interested in a tiny home community. And the way we envision that is that part of the community could be tiny homes and the other part could be like a single unit building that houses more people. That could be a really great model actually for people who are interested in living in a tiny home. Tiny homes are not the most environmentally friendly option. They're better than a single family home that's big for sure. But from our perspective, from an environmental perspective, we'd like to see people as much as possible sharing walls. So at least in row housing or smaller unit buildings, multi-unit buildings. So I don't know if that answers that question, the first part. And what was the second part, Ian?
Second part is, in a more urban setting, how much land would be required?
Yeah, so it really depends. So for example, we have a group forming right now called Great Rivers Cohousing, and they're just in the point of trying to determine how much land, what size of property that we're looking for them for. So they're looking at a 2 or 3 building model. So where each building has, you know, between 6 to 10 households potentially. And we think we can get them that on probably a double lot. I think off the top, so that would be a 3-story building. A lot, maybe 80 feet wide by 100 deep is kind of what we're looking at for them. And that for us in the Ottawa area, that seems to, for that type of building. Of course, if you're a single building, like the one I mentioned in Vancouver, Little Mountain Cohousing, I think it's just a building. And there's another one in Vancouver in North Vancouver called Quayside. Quayside is a single building. And it was the first urban co-housing community in Canada. And they have very little outside of their building. Like their building takes up the entire property. And I think it's a 5-story building. And they have some rooftop gardens, actually. That's where they get their green. So it really depends on the community, what the group is seeking, right? So the group we're working with right now, Great Rivers, they're not interested in a big single unit building. They do want some grounds around their buildings, even though they do want to be urban. So for them, we're looking at that, like I said, shorter and a couple of different buildings, but on the same property. So we'll probably need to get them a double lot somewhere.
Awesome. Okay. Quick questions from Tim here. And you may have covered this one already, but let's see. If a community member decides to leave, what are the benefits and disadvantages to the tenant in selling?
For the person who's leaving, what are the advantages and disadvantages? So here's an advantage. If you want to leave your community, the first people you can reach out to are the other people in the community. Because, for example, let's say you're a 2-bedroom unit, and now you've split up with your partner and you don't want to be in the same community anymore. So now you don't need a 2-bedroom anymore. Somebody within the community might be looking for a 2-bedroom. Let's say they've just hooked up with somebody from outside the community. They want to get out of their 1-bedroom. So the first thing is you'll have people within your community who may want your unit instead of their own. The second thing is there's very likely to be a list of people wanting to live in your community. In the lower mainland of BC, they have a list of 400 people, 400 households who are seeking co-housing. They're waiting for the next community to be available or for units to be available within the existing communities. We're hopeful that this will happen here as the idea of co-housing picks up, that there will be people who are interested in it. So that's a benefit in that you have a model of housing that's very unique and that's very sought after, and you put in all your sweat and equity into getting it constructed. These people are taking advantage of that, and they are very happy to move into the place that you've created with your co-residents. So that's an advantage. I'm not sure what the disadvantage is, except that your purchaser needs to be on board with the community, as we talked about. But legally, there's no disadvantage. You can sell your unit at market rates, and co-housing market rates are equal, if not better, than what you'd find outside of co-housing. Like the listed price for a co-housing unit is the same or higher than you'd find elsewhere in a condominium, for example, regular condominium.
Okay, awesome. 2 more questions, and I think it'll be a good way to finish off here. These will be our last ones. When Anne is asking, how do you get involved if they're interested in co-housing in Ottawa? I imagine we go to Ottawa Cohousing.ca. Would that be?
Yeah, it's a good first step is just go to our website and have a look at everything we have to offer there. Within our website is a next steps page, and they can join an info session. We have some free info sessions listed. They can literally just send me an email, just like send a contact. We'll put them on our email list for updates, and they can just contact us directly. We're happy to entertain one-on-one conversations at any time.
Okay, and then the last question I think is actually tied to that. Are there financial costs involved in using co-housing consultants?
Yes, of course, there are consultants need to get paid. So yes, consultants run as businesses, the majority of them. Some are nonprofit, but the majority of them are full-fledged businesses. It does cost money. However, the time cost that a good co-housing consultant can give you usually makes up for that cost, because they're helping you with the facilitation and running your project, keeping you on time, and the connections they have to potential development partners and so forth, that can save you a lot of money, and a lot of headache, for example, stuff that you would learn the hard way if you're doing it on your own. So but they do cost money. There's a cost to it for sure. For example, for us, our costs, if you're using us, Ottawa Cohousing, we charge on a percentage basis of your final unit cost, but similar to a real estate agent, which you no longer need. You don't need a real estate agent for your community. Like if there was one involved, it falls under us. So it's not that much of a displacement to hire us over a real estate agent in this case, if you're looking for a new house, for example.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Linda. That was super informative. The number of questions I think speaks to how interested people are in this. So we really appreciate you speaking to this. And let's wrap up. So thanks again, Linda. Thanks to everyone who came today. If you have a moment to share your thoughts on today's webinar, you'll receive a post-webinar survey in your email from Zoom. I'd like to mention that we are supported by memberships and donations. If you'd like to become a member or contribute to our educational programs, including the webinar series, you can do so on our website at www.humanistcanada.ca. And our next webinar will take place on January 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be joined by Dr. Nathan Gillette, who will present on the physical science basis behind climate change. You can get more information about that on our website, social media platforms, and newsletters. That's it from me. Have a nice rest of your weekend and a lovely holiday season. Take good care.
Thank you, everyone.